Welcome to the 4Heroes podcast. Today's message is lessons from the end of Moses' life. That might sound like it could be sad, but I promise it's super encouraging. Often we find meaning when we look at our lives with the end in mind, and Moses is no different. He is remembered as a servant of the Lord. Chaplain Frank Mercer gives us a deeper look at God's purpose for Moses' life. Every season of our lives is purposeful, even the final one. This episode raises some important questions. Questions like, what would be on my tombstone? Also questions about what Moses' life and death teach us about the life and death of Jesus.
Pretty cool stuff in the back end of Numbers, but we're just going to jump right over that. We're skipping some pretty exciting stuff. I mean, there's an infestation of poisonous snakes in the camp. There's a talking donkey. And we're going to jump over most of Deuteronomy. We're going to go to the very last chapter of Deuteronomy. The entire book of Deuteronomy is this next generation, the adults who came out of Egypt and were not allowed to go into the promised land because they refused. And God said, 40 years you're going to wander in the wilderness until all of you are dead, and then your children can go into the promised land. Well, they're finally all dead. Dead and buried in the desert. So Deuteronomy is really kind of all about Moses prepping this next generation to be faithful to the covenant. There's a lot of Moses sermons, and it's great. But we're going to skip most of it. We're going to stay with the narrative and jump right to the very last chapter of Deuteronomy, because the very last chapter of Deuteronomy is really the end of Moses' story. Moses is going to a place called Mount Nebo to die. I mean, all of us are going to die sometime, right? I read this in The Onion last week. World Health Organization officials expressed disappointment at the group's finding that despite the best efforts of doctors, emergency medical personnel, and other medical professionals worldwide, the global death rate remains constant at 100%. In fact, death is responsible for 100% of all recorded fatalities worldwide. The condition, to date, has no cure. Moses, like all of us, is going to die. Deuteronomy chapter 34, I'm going to start reading in verse 1. The Bible says this: Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. And there the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. And then the Lord said to him, This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I've let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. God calls Moses to Mount Nebo. Mount Nebo, if you know the geography of Israel, it's about 15 miles east of Jericho. It's on the other side of the Jordan. I've seen Mount Nebo from the Israeli side. Mount Nebo is actually in the kingdom of Jordan. When I was in Israel, we went to the top of a place called Masada, and from Masada you can look across the Dead Sea and see Mount Nebo. Just the ironic thing to me is that I was standing in the land that Moses was not allowed to go into. I'm standing on Masada, looking across to Mount Nebo. He was on Mount Nebo, wishing that he could be on the side that we were on our trip. But he does get to see the promise. He's not going to possess it, but he's going to see the promise. He's not going to get to live in it. He's going to die on that mountain. Verse 5. Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite of Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. One of the great mysteries. Moses was 120 years old when he died. Yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. 120 years old, and his eyes have not dimmed, his strength is not gone. 120. Think about that. You know, I'm not half his age yet, but I feel like I'm twice his age. A lot of mornings, 120 years old.
He had a different diet.
That's true. Yeah, there's no question about that. The first 40 years, he's a prince of Egypt, right? He's living a life of privilege. Everybody treats him like he is somebody. The next 40 years, he's a fugitive / shepherd living in the desert in Moab, and he feels like he's a nobody. God uses those first 80 years to prepare him for the next 40 years. He uses 2/3 of Moses' life to prepare him for that last third. And life is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And God is working. Maybe God has you in a season of preparation, waiting for what's next. You might feel like you're just spinning your wheels. I'll bet he did, out there in the desert tending those sheep, hoping not to be found, spinning my wheels, waiting to die. But that's not what God was doing, He encounters God at that burning bush, and God calls him to be the deliverer of the Hebrew people, to go to Egypt, to confront the most powerful man in the world, to confront the Pharaoh. Let my people go. And God is going to set them free. It's not going to be Pharaoh. It's going to be God literally is going to force Pharaoh's hand to set the people free. And you're going to bring them out of there, and you're going to bring them to the promised land. And he did. He brought them right up to the gate. But think about that. I mean, he became God's mouthpiece, God's ambassador, God's deliverer, God's lawgiver, God's prophet. This guy who for 2/3 of his life seemed like he was just spinning his wheels. That last third, man, so significant, so valuable that we're still talking about it this morning in a coffee shop in Tyrone, far removed from Mount Nebo. We have a hard time seeing God's purposes in the season that we're in, but God has purpose every season of life. Every season of life is purposeful to produce something that would have never happened otherwise. And you have this funeral that you're not given a lot of details about, but I'll tell you, I just imagine it as one of the great funerals in the Bible. God buries him in a secret place. Why a secret place? I don't know. Maybe Israel would have worshiped Moses, his memory, would have built a big shrine to him, might not have even gone into the promised land because they're leaving Moses behind, or might have taken Moses' body with them into the promised land. Remember, Joseph's bones were in Egypt and they brought his bones out. Maybe they would have brought Moses with them, and that would have been in direct disobedience to what God had said, that he's not going to enter. Don't really know, a lot of theories. At the end of the day, with something like that, I just always think I'm on a need-to-know basis, and I must not need to know, or God would have been more direct about it. Sometimes you just got to accept that. I am a fan of cemeteries. I like going to cemeteries and walking around. I like looking at the headstones. I like imagining the people and what their lives were like and what the situation was like when this person passed. I like reading the epitaphs. There's some really good ones. Here are some of my favorites, and these are all real. Here lies an atheist all dressed up and no place to go. I like that one. I came here without being consulted, and I leave without my consent. Also good. Here lies the body of Jonathan Blake, stepped on the gas instead of the brake. Oh, man. There's no tombstone for Moses, obviously, but if there was one, it might say Moses, the servant of the Lord, because that's what that passage just called him. Moses, the servant of the Lord. Not Moses, the prince of Egypt, or Moses, the shepherd in the wilderness, or Moses, the deliverer of Israel, or Moses, the miracle worker, or Moses, the prophet. Just simply Moses, the servant of God, who might be banned from Canaan and sentenced to die at Mount Nebo, but he's not remembered here for his failures. He's remembered for his service. His life is a reminder to us that God works through broken people. He might have brought the law down from the mountain, but also he broke the law. He was broken just like you and I are, and it gives us hope to know that God himself remembers Moses as his servant. God's servant to the very end. I don't know what you imagine is going to go on your tombstone, but it'd be pretty cool if your tombstone said, Dave, servant of God. You know? Numbers 34:9. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, and so the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Joshua's name means God our salvation. The New Testament equivalent to Joshua's name is Jesus. Did you know that? God our salvation. That's what it means in the Greek. Moses is always identified with the law. Always identified with the law. He's the lawgiver, brings the law down from the mountain. You think about the Ten Commandments, you think about Moses. You think about Charlton Heston holding those stone tablets. Moses is always identified with the law. And what do we know about the law? That the law will never get you into the promised land. Because we're all lawbreakers. We've all broken the law. So if the law won't get you into the promised land, what gets you into the promised land? Only Jesus. Only Jesus. God, our salvation. I mean, it's the Greek equivalent to the Hebrew name Yeshua, which we pronounce as Joshua, God our salvation. Moses couldn't get into the promised land. The law couldn't get you into the promised land. Moses dies under the penalty of his own sin. He dies and is buried and remains buried. Jesus, God our salvation, Yeshua, he died under the penalty of our sin. Not his sin, he was sinless. The sinless Son of God became sin for us. He died under the penalty of our sin, was buried, but didn't stay dead and didn't stay buried. Right? He's the greater Moses. That's what Hebrews says. He is our deliverer who brought us out of the land of sin and slavery and into the land of promise, into the land of the living. That's Jesus. Because the law can't get you in. The law can't get you in. Moses can't get you in. And so God sends them Joshua, God our salvation. They mourned for 30 days, cried their eyes out. He was the only leader they'd ever had. He's kind of the spiritual father of the nation. You think about it, this is the next generation. I mean, their parents knew what life was like before Moses. They never knew what life was like without Moses in their lives. He had known them all of their lives. They had known him all of their lives, and he's gone. And maybe you know what it's like to lose somebody like that. somebody that you loved like that and had so much influence on your life, and they mourned and they cried. But if you've ever been in that place of grief and mourning, you know that you can't just stay in Moab and mourn. There comes a time when you have to pack up the tent and move on. God spoke through Moses, revealed things to Moses. God gave Moses the law, but leadership is now transferred to Joshua. Chief Mundy likes to say there's two things that cops hate. They hate change, and they hate for things to stay the same.
They hate change and they hate the way things are.
They hate the way things are. Yeah, that's so much better. Yeah. Things are never going to be the same. New leader, new challenges, new opportunities. As Bob Dylan says, the times, they are a-changing. They are. But God is constant. We got to make peace with changes that we see happening all around us and happening in us, changes happening in our bodies as we get older, the changes happening in our communities, the changes happening in our world. Nothing stays the same. You know, nature itself tells you that. We had spring, it was beautiful. We had summer, a little too hot for my taste. Now we're into fall, but every now and then, like later this week, you get a little taste of winter. Your life is like that. You know, there are seasons to life, seasons of change. God sets the tempo for those seasons, but God is the one constant who does not change. Verse 10, since then no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all these signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. And that's the end of the book. It's the end of the first 5 books. First 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the Torah, the law. Those 5 books take us from the Garden of Eden to the burial of Moses and right up to the brink of the Hebrews stepping into the land of promise. That's it. It's the end of Moses' life, and I'm told, I don't know if this is true, but I'm told that when the book of the Torah is finished in a synagogue, the congregation in the synagogue recites these words, except in Hebrew. Be strong, and encourage one another. I asked the only person in our group who speaks Hebrew with some fluency if he would say those words to us in that language.
In modern Hebrew would be תהיה חזק, ולתמוך אחד בשני.
So let's do that, yeah. With all of these things in mind that God's Word has taught us so far, be strong. Be strong and support. Encourage one another. That's all I got to say about that.
Thanks for listening to the 4Heroes podcast. Maybe after hearing this message, you need someone to talk to about how the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus can bring you into the promised land. Please contact us. Our email is info@4ourheroes.org. You can also message us on social media or text our lead public safety chaplain at 770-681-5964. If you'd like to take a step in supporting ministry to first responders, we'd love to hear from you. This work is incredibly important. Even heroes need a helping hand.